the south of France. The story says the group included some of the closest followers of Jesus, Lazarus, whom Jesus had raised from the dead, and the repentant prostitute named Mary Magdalene. But what if we told you there was more to the story? What if we told you that some people think Mary Magdalene was not a repentant prostitute, but instead the wife of Jesus, that she bore his child, that there is a bloodline that survived, that the truth was suppressed by the church, but handed down through a secret society, whose most famous member was Leonardo da Vinci, and that Leonardo encoded the truth in some of his most famous paintings.
Certainly, Mary Magdalene, in my mind, was a much more important figure in history than a lot of us really were led to believe. And the Holy Grail has become a metaphor for her as well, primarily because from the time of Mary Magdalene, really until the present, these were ideas that we could not talk about overtly. An alternative history, a dangerous history. They had to be talked about through metaphor.
Dan Brown is the author of the best-selling novel, The Da Vinci Code. It is based in part on ideas found in a book that appeared several years ago as a non-fiction investigation, a book published in the early 1980s called Holy Blood, Holy Grail. It was the source of much controversy because, among other things, it theorized that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married, that they had a child, and the secret of the bloodline that survived was protected for centuries by a secret society whose military arm at one point was the Knights Templar. Historically, we know several facts about the Knights Templar. To begin, they were a real order of knights during the Crusades. These are, or were, some of them. The founders were a handful of French noblemen, some of whom were related to one another.
The Knights Templar were an order of warrior monks. A perfectly extraordinary idea. Warriors kill people, monks in general don't.
They have a reputation for shouting their religious battle cries, storming in against the Muslim army, and getting wiped out. And when they become martyrs, they hope that their sins will be washed away completely and they will go straight to heaven.
In the early 12th century, the Knights Templar showed up in Jerusalem. At first, there were only 9 of them. In a short time, their number grew, and they became very wealthy and very powerful. Even the Pope gave them special privileges. They took up residence around and beneath the new Christian headquarters, built on the site of what was the Jewish temple centuries earlier, when Jesus was alive. The Templars were rumored to have found something deep beneath these structures, in an underground area called Solomon's Stables. The rumor was they brought back to France some sort of treasure.
Well, the theory is that it was documents that were contrary to the story of Christ that had been put out by the church.
Whatever they found, the Knights Templar expanded and grew for about 200 years until they were rounded up by King Philip of France, accused of heresy, interrogated, tortured, and executed by the Vatican's thought police, the Inquisition. Tell me what makes you believe, from your research, that they found documents beneath Solomon's temple that said Jesus was married and Mary Magdalene was his wife.
It makes logical sense. There is no other explanation that I can see for why these knights would suddenly become so powerful and then be turned on by the Vatican in a very brutal way, except if they were trying to, if the church was trying to somehow keep documents hidden.
I started more or less this collection when I was...
Other people who have spent years studying the Knights Templar think this theory is ridiculous. Umberto Eco has written several books, including The Name of the Rose. He has an entire room in his home that he calls his library of books about wrong theories. Is there anything to the theory that the Knights Templar found something beneath the former Solomon's temple in Jerusalem that was so valuable that it made them...
Money.
They found money there.
Money.
Not documents, not information that they used to then blackmail.
We have no documents about that, but we have documents that they made a lot of money.
In fact, the Templars had so much money they became the bankers of Europe. Most scholars think the Templars were wiped out, not because they had some secret that threatened the Vatican, but instead because of the greed of King Philip of France.
Over the course of 2 centuries, they became enormously wealthy, hugely wealthy, and it was clearly their wealth that caught the eye of Philip the Fair in France at the beginning of the 14th century. He had already attacked the Jews and the Lombards for their money, and in 1307 he thought that probably he could go for the Templars as well.
And Philip the Fair, King of France, apparently had a pretty good motive. He was in debt and needed cash desperately. He apparently owed a lot of money to the Templars.
The charges laid against them by Philip in the 1307 were really extraordinary, really grotesque. Forms of blasphemy, of urinating on a cross, cursing Christ. Surely not. Unimaginable.
The Templars were totally, boringly orthodox. There was nothing heretical about them. Boringly so. Perhaps that's why the charges stuck, because people were so surprised. It was the big lie. You use the big lie against someone, you make it big enough, people say, but the King of France would never lie like that.
And just like that, the Templars and their money were gone. There has always been speculation that if they did bring a treasure with them from Jerusalem, they hid it somewhere before they were wiped out. All we know for sure is that the Templars made their last stand against the French king here, in the hills and the valleys of Languedoc, just north of Spain. And the region is filled with history that some believe suggests the secret is in fact hidden here. Margaret Starbird believes that the secret has to do with Mary Magdalene.
They named many churches for her. Fountains are named for her. She's the patron saint of vineyards. There's a lot of Magdalene energy and Magdalene relics, you might say, in the southern part of France.
One place she sees evidence of this is in the collection of watermarks, symbols stamped onto paper and manuscripts in the Middle Ages.
The Lion of Judah. The Lion of Judah. Yeah, it's like the Lion of Judah.
I will grant you, the tail looks very odd.
That is the Merovingian symbol.
The symbol, says Starbird, is of that early French royal bloodline, the Merovingian kings. So what do you, as a scholar of this, read into this?
Well, this is the watermark from the 15th century. And the Lion of Judah was one of the titles of Christ. It's actually mentioned in the book of Revelation. This one has a crown, and he has the Merovingian bloodline in his tail. It's rather graphic that this is a bloodline, a reference to the bloodline. So it's a heretical watermark.
This would be considered heretical. Why?
Because the church denies that Christ was married and that his bloodline exists.
It is true that the south of France was a hotbed of heretical movements in the early medieval days. Groups like the Templars were persecuted and killed because they held views that differed from the Roman Catholic Church in power. As with the Templars, it has been suggested that it was actually because they were hiding a dangerous secret. The ruins of Montségur Castle, high on a mountain in southern France, are a reminder of one of those groups, the Cathars. Their name, Cathari, means pure in Greek. They relied upon personal revelations as opposed to guidance or instructions handed down from the religious authorities of the time. Branded heretics by the Roman Catholic Church, very little remains to tell us about them other than Inquisition records.
They put some to the stake, and they had the massacre at Montségur, where they took more than 200 heretics and burned them alive. And that was 1244. So this whole early part of the 13th century is a bloody battle over this whole area of southern France.
The Cathars did make a last stand and were in fact burned to death in Montségur. Margaret Starbird believes that it was because they followed a secret belief, a secret about Mary Magdalene, and that they glorified women. Historians of the period disagree.
No, I'm afraid it's rather the opposite, because we have Cathars accusing women of being demons because they have babies. The Cathars' own writings that survive, and what the theologians who came into contact with them say, is that the Cathars believed in two principles: the evil principle, which is physical, and the good principle, which is spiritual. The net result of this is that anything that is physical of the body is from the devil. So in fact, in that respect, women are evil in Cathar theology, because they have the means of perpetuating life and therefore of continuing to capture spirits in evil bodies.
Whatever the truth is about their beliefs, they died with them. We had spoken with several of the authors whose books provided inspiration for the Da Vinci Code novel. We now understood that they had developed a theory based on fragmentary information about what went on here in the Middle Ages. The Templars and their treasure, the heresy of the Cathars. They believed these people shared a secret that they passed down in stories, like the legends of the Grail, and that they were persecuted by the church because of it.
Well, the Inquisition was formed in part to root these people out.
Remember that this is a theory, and a theory held by very few people other than Margaret Starbird.
Well, what happens is, every vacuum, needs to be filled. And that's how legends grow up. When you know something about someone, and then you kind of want to know more, and then things get put into the biography that are a little bit exaggerated. And then as time goes on, more gets in and more gets in. And then you get further and further away from the original source, and you're not quite so sure what's reality and what's inflation, what's legend, if you will.
One reason this whole region has gotten new attention in the last century is because in the late 1800s, it was the setting for a new series of bizarre and still mysterious events. A poor priest named Father Berenger Saunière was assigned to the rundown church of the Magdalene, here in a place called Rennes-le-Château. The story goes that Father Saunière was repairing the altar when he found some sort of treasure. Like the Knights Templar and like the Cathars, he became rich. He rebuilt the church and decorated it with strange things. And he became powerful. Famous people came to see him, like Aimé Calvet, a well-known French opera singer. Claude Debussy, the French composer.
We are told that they came here. And we had not only a famous opera singer and Claude Debussy, famous composer, we also had a Habsburg Archduke. It's also said that he came here. He seemed to move suddenly into really rather splendid circles.
Father Saunière also apparently expanded his house and took in a housekeeper.
Marie de Narnaud. She was a pretty girl. She moved in with him when she was 18, and she looked after him for the rest of her life. well, the rest of his life.
And when mysteriously a local bishop suddenly tried to remove Father Saunière from this tiny parish, the Vatican authorities equally mysteriously intervened to protect him.
I knew them, but I don't know what happened up there.
Did Father Saunière ever say where he got his money? Did he ever tell you where he got his money?
No, he never told us. He was not stupid enough to tell us.
Of course, one popular idea is that this might have something to do with whatever the secret treasure was that the Knights Templar brought back from Jerusalem during the Crusades. Secret knowledge about Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and their bloodline. Another version of the story goes that when Father Saunière died, he left his fortune to his housekeeper and confidant Marie. A few years later, when the French government asked for records on where the fortune came from, the story goes that Marie burned it rather than tell.
That's what they found. Nobody knows.
I know nobody knows, but what do you think might have been on those documents that made him so rich so suddenly?
They were written in Old Latin. And for sure he found some information, you know, some things, that he could have power.
Do you believe somehow that whatever those documents were had something to do with Mary Magdalene?
My personal impression is yes. That is, I mean, I believe those documents had something to do with Mary Magdalene. I have absolutely, there is no one piece of evidence that I can turn to and say, that's why I believe that, but it fits the story.
Dan Brown is apparently more convinced than the man who first popularized the theory. Is it possible this whole tale of Father Saunière finding secret parchments under the altar is a complete myth?
Of course.
What do you believe?
I neither believe nor disbelieve anything. I either know or I don't know.
And you don't know?
I don't know.
If any part of this tale is true?
I don't know. A lot of people think they know. They read what I've written and they think that they know. They don't realize that those stories, when I write them, are written in the conditional. And I always precede those recountings of stories by saying, it is said that, or we are told that.
When we come back, if Jesus and Mary had a child, as some claim, and a bloodline did survive, where are the descendants today? We'd come to the south of France to track down some claims made in the very controversial novel, The Da Vinci Code, that Mary Magdalene and Jesus had descendants who married into the first Christian kings of the region, the Merovingians, that their descendants married into noble families who eventually dispersed throughout Europe, that these families formed a secret society called the Priory of Sion and created the medieval Knights Templar as their military wing, and that the Priory had enlisted some of the greatest thinkers in European history as grand masters of their mysterious organization. So did the Priory of Sion actually exist? We interviewed a lot of historians and writers, and many of them just dismiss this Priory of Zion as being some modern fabrication.
I don't think we'll ever know. I don't think there's any way to know. They've been portrayed as everything from an elaborate hoax to a still existent, very powerful secret society in Europe.
The idea that the Priory does exist comes primarily from those strange documents we told you about, the ones that are stored in the French library, the Dossiers Secrets. Nobody had ever seen them until they surfaced in 1966. They contained several family trees dating back to French nobility. References to a secret society, the Priory, with grand masters such as Leonardo da Vinci protecting some unknown secret.
You know, there are so many stories about Leonardo da Vinci. For centuries, people has elaborated about the smile of Mona Lisa, that to give him another connection with Priory of Zion doesn't disturb anybody, except the fact that I have the impression that the first news about the Priory of Zion spread out 3 centuries after the death of Leonardo.
You don't think the Priory of Zion existed when Leonardo
No,
da Vinci
I don't
was
think
alive?
so.
Many experts dismiss the whole idea of a Priory of Zion and the secret of a holy bloodline as a very late invention, a literary hoax. So you're aware of this book, the Da Vinci Code, which puts out the theory that Leonardo da Vinci was one of the guardians of the secret that Mary Magdalene was married to Jesus, and that he secretly put little stories or clues to that in his works of art, his most famous works of art.
Well, I can't speak to what he thought or didn't think, because we have no evidence of that whatsoever. There's nothing from the period that would suggest that he had any knowledge of the Priory of Zion, or that he had any knowledge of the relationship between Christ and the Magdalene. That he put these things in a code-like fashion into his paintings, I doubt very seriously.
I spent some time in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. I saw the documents that list the Grand Masters of the Priory, enigmatically named les Dossiers Secrets, possibly too enigmatically named, I don't know. One thing left out to me about this list of people, men and women on this list, by the way. They were all very forward thinkers of their time. They were people who really thought outside the box, who in many ways rejected the norms of their day. And they just seemed like people for whom this history would make sense, that they would become passionate about it if they believed it.
But if this whole theory is true, where are the descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene now? What has become of the Grail family? In the Da Vinci Code, the novelist focuses on a family whose name is also mentioned in the dossier, the St. Clair family. After much searching, we ended up locating 2 Scottish nobles living in London who say they are a branch of the St. Clair family, the Sinclairs. So what was your reaction when you found out that you were being called one of the descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene?
That didn't affect me in any way whatsoever.
You don't feel a little...
I certainly haven't been going around looking for a second-hand halo, if that's what you mean.
A Sinclair ancestor, William Sinclair, built a famous church called Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland. It also appears in Dan Brown's book as a venue for clues about a powerful secret, that of the sacred feminine and Mary Magdalene's importance.
I don't think anybody there will claim that Rosslyn is a mystical place and that the Holy Grail is either there or was there at some time. And yet, standing in there, you definitely get the sense that something very, very special was hidden there at some point.
Rosslyn is often referred to as the Chapel of the Grail that appears in the legends of King Arthur. It is filled with Grail-like architectural motifs.
You'll find 50 temples of Solomon there, you will find serpents of wisdom, and on the roof you will find what is the greatest of the Grail romances, Parzival, the original Parzival. And you will see the dove bearing down.
Niven Sinclair's cousin Andrew says taking care of the Grail is a Sinclair family tradition.
They've always been the guardians of holy treasures, particularly the Grail. They're the Knights of the Grail.
And when we confronted the Sinclairs with the theory, your family married into Jesus' bloodline.
Well, by the time it gets to me, it'll be very, very, very diluted.
Niven Sinclair believes clues pointing to a special relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, her importance in the church, and a sacred meaning can be found in his ancestors' chapel. And when you say in the Rosslyn Chapel that Mary Magdalene is depicted there,
yes.
How is she depicted?
In the ceiling, where you have the five-pointed star of Venus. So here again is the female side, which is being emphasized.
And, I mean, is there an actual representation of Mary Magdalene, or is it just the five-pointed star?
There is the five-pointed star there.
And that's it? No figure of a woman
No
purported
figure
to be?
of a woman, no.
Both Sinclairs say that the church tried to marginalize Mary Magdalene, but as far as whether or not their family is clearly descended from Jesus and Mary Magdalene, Niven Sinclair's cousin Andrew is more of a skeptic.
There's no proof that actually this is the bloodline of Mary Magdalene and Jesus.
At this point, we felt we'd scoured the legends surrounding Mary Magdalene in Europe pretty thoroughly and had come up with fascinating but thin circumstantial evidence. There was, however, one more place we needed to look. And they were, except for one set of copies, and it remained hidden in Egypt until about 50 years ago.
The Nag Hammadi scrolls, which essentially tell what you might call an alternative history of the time of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, the church made a very concerted effort to take these documents and destroy them throughout time.
Historians think these documents were originally hidden by a monk from a nearby monastery in the late 4th century. At the same time, they were ordered destroyed by the Bishop of Alexandria.
The question historians ask themselves is, if the church was making such a concerted effort to destroy this information, you have to assume that it was fairly explosive.
These writings have names like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Truth, and the Gospel of Philip. A fragment found in a different place is called the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. They're sometimes called the Gnostic Gospels. Gnostic means knowledge, and the groups who wrote them often claimed special knowledge about Jesus. But did these documents contain information that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married?
There is a line that states very clearly that Mary Magdalene was the favorite of Jesus, and he kissed her often on the mouth.
Well, sort of. Apparently the parchments are damaged.
In the Gospel of Philip, Jesus is kissing Mary Magdalene often on the, and then there's this hole in the text, actually, into which you can insert the word mouth or foot or cheek or forehead. But anyway, whatever it is that he's kissing, the other disciples are jealous.
And whether Jesus loves Mary in some kind of sexual way is a possible implication of the story.
The same text, the Gospel of Philip, also says Mary Magdalene was called his companion.
The word koinonos in Greek can mean companion and often means partner.
There is these tantalizing hints, but they're not definitive.
The 4 New Testament Gospels are thought to have been written several decades after Jesus lived, but there is some question about when the Gnostic Gospels were written. All we know for sure is that some of them were around in the 2nd century, and that in the 4th century the church officially rejected them. So some scholars think the Gnostic Gospels should be disregarded. Elaine Pagels disagrees.
From internal evidence and from evidence of manuscript traditions, we realize that in fact some of them may be in fact very early.
Pagels says they do tell us how Mary Magdalene was remembered and regarded by some early Christians.
If I were guessing, and we are guessing, I would guess that there was a special relationship between Mary Magdalene and Jesus. I would also guess that it did not take a sexual form.
Pagels thinks the language about kissing is symbolic, but that there is evidence Mary Magdalene was remembered as a powerful figure in the movement. In the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Jesus' closest followers, including Peter, Andrew, and Mary, or sitting together after the crucifixion, talking.
Peter steps in and he asks Mary Magdalene to tell the disciples anything that the Savior may have told her, but that they didn't know.
And to Peter's chagrin, Mary responds, Peter, I'll tell you not only what you don't know, but what he kept from you. And at that point, she begins to say that she had just seen the Lord in a vision and he spoke to her.
Andrew objects, and he says, well, I don't know what the rest of you think about this, but I don't believe these things. They seem very strange. And Peter steps in and says, well, surely Jesus didn't love a woman more than us. And at this point, Mary cries. I always wish she wouldn't do that, but she does. And says, Peter, do you think I made all this up?
But those scholars who think these Gnostic Gospels were written at least a century after Jesus say you can't rely on them to provide real information. For example, in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus, who was depicted in the Bible as being progressive regarding women, is suddenly made to sound like a male chauvinist.
And the women in the audience are going to love this. The disciples bring Mary Magdalene to Jesus, and they say, Lord, we have a problem. Mary Magdalene is a woman, and of course women cannot inherit the kingdom of God. Jesus replies, don't worry, I'll turn her into a man, and then she can make it. Of course it's not something Jesus would have said. This is a fake document.
Let's not romanticize these Apocrypha. Some of these Apocrypha tell stories of Jesus' childhood. And what was Jesus like as a kid? Well, they had Jesus picking up, little pieces of clay and then turning them into birds, or striking his playmates dead if he lost in a game of hopscotch or something. In other words, using his, quote, divine powers.
Come on, they wrote about that?
Yeah, that's the point. I mean, the same body of literature has a lot of this silly stuff about Jesus and Jesus the brat, using his divine powers to terrorize and to dominate his playmates.
All of the Gospels are part of a bigger picture. I don't think anybody can say, I believe these Gospels or these Gospels. By nature of the fact that they are oral histories, none is going to be perfectly complete. None is going to be perfectly accurate. They're all critical pieces of the puzzle, a puzzle that we now have more pieces to and is starting to make more sense as a whole. And by putting all the pieces together, I think we get a much clearer image of who Mary Magdalene was.
In the novel The Da Vinci Code, Mary Magdalene is portrayed as more important to Jesus than any of us could have imagined. The novel even claims that she was his wife. The novelist says clues that this is the case lie in documents found in Egypt in the mid-1940s, known as the Gnostic Gospels.
I did a lot of research in Rome and started to understand that there were an enormous number of historians who felt that there was information, whether it's in the Vatican archives or whether it's buried in museums, wherever it is, that talked about other Gospels, other stories of Christ, other stories of his relationship with Mary Magdalene. Now remember, the story that we read in the Bible is a partial story, and it's an edited story. The Gnostic Gospels, a lot of historians feel, are the missing piece.
As we have said, we found that Brown is correct, that there were writings suppressed by the early church. Prominent academics agree that in the early centuries of Christianity, there were many different groups calling themselves Christian, with radically different points of view.
We know that in the early communities there were dozens of writings circulating, not 4 Gospels, but many, many more.
And they do say that the church suppressed the so-called Gospels or religious writings of groups that did not adhere to what they called orthodox doctrines.
Within 350 years after the death of Jesus, becoming a Christian, not according to the doctrines laid down by the church and the creed and condoned by the emperor and the bishops, could be seen as possibly a crime.
Just as today, in the early centuries of Christianity, religion and politics were intimately related, and those in power used it to do what they thought was God's will.
Books like the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and many others were burned and destroyed. I mean, virtually all copies of that.
However, no scholar we spoke to believed the church suppressed these Gospels because they contained a secret about a marriage between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The truth is far more complicated, an argument over theological doctrines.
There was deliberate suppression of this material by leaders of the church back then and ever since, because there's certain kind of material that some church authorities have thought is not good for their congregations from their point of view.
The Gnostics are the ones who lost out in the battle for Christianity. What we've come to realize with the discovery of a whole new range of texts from Egypt is how incredibly diverse early Christianity was, much, much more so than we ever thought.
We found that even though these experts don't agree with Dan Brown's conclusion that the so-called Gnostic Gospels tell us Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married, they do agree that Mary plays a significant role in many of them.
Well, the role of Mary Magdalene in the Gospel of Mary is more prominent than it is, for example, in the New Testament Gospels. The tradition that there was a special relationship between Jesus and Mary is very ancient. This is certainly one of the things that the new literature that we've discovered in Egypt shows us. We see her called the most beloved woman of Jesus. We hear her called the most beloved disciple.
And there is evidence, even outside the Gnostic Gospels, that in the first centuries after Jesus, Mary Magdalene was treated with great respect by several of the early church leaders who were men.
You don't need to go to the Gnostic Gospels in order to find a high view of Mary and a praise of her for her faith. For instance, an early Christian father will make the claim that she is the apostle to the apostles. Another will declare that she is the tower of faith.
I think, again, I'll go back, I'm stubborn, I'll go back to my point. Mary Magdalene's importance is already made clear in the New Testament that we do have. I can't think of anything more important to situate Mary Magdalene in the big picture as an important person in Christianity than the fact that she was in 3 accounts of the resurrection. She was the primary witness of the resurrection, even above Peter.
But many scholars told us that Mary Magdalene becomes less and less important in church writings, and she is replaced by Mary, the mother of Jesus. So what happened? One explanation is that she was a victim of a power struggle over the role of women in the church 100 years after Jesus. One bishop in southern France writes that he is enraged at groups that allow women to participate in giving communion, for example.
Another famous teacher, Tertullian, in North Africa about the same time, says, these heretical women, how audacious they are. They baptize, they claim to teach, they claim to heal, they do all sorts of terrible and audacious things that they have absolutely no right to do, which are really functions for men.
There's a battle going on, and in our texts of the 2nd century, we can see it laid out. Mary Magdalene was clearly privileged. To any male-dominated hierarchy, this is dangerous, of course, because there comes also the attraction and the appeal of women. Are they seducers, or are they the route to insight? Should we be close to them, or should we stay clear of them? Very tense, very tense.
What you find about the year 150 or the year 200 is the systematic exclusion of women from any positions where they would be visible, where they would speak out, where they would have roles of authority.
That effort to marginalize women may be why Mary Magdalene diminished in importance over the years.
I think it's very likely that it was deliberate. I think the charge that she was a prostitute is an excellent way of refuting the claim that she is a specially revered apostle and teacher.
As historians, we can't really say what people's motives were. What we can do is we can look at the effects. And the effects were clearly to undermine women's authority in the church.
We'll have some final thoughts when we come back.
Our history books have been written by the winners, those societies or those individuals who have conquered and survived.
Every picture, every stained glass window from infancy onwards, there is Jesus in a white robe, long hair and a beard, standing by himself, surrounded at a modest and gracious distance by 12 men. How different it would be if our image of Jesus needed instead to be of Jesus with a wife and with children around him. What difference would it make? Well, it would certainly reopen the question, what does the church think about sex?
Christianity has had a very unhealthy attitude to sexuality. And had Jesus been married, and I'm not discounting the possibility, but if we had clear evidence that he was married, and even that he had a family, that would have knocked out of the box all this nonsense that has been part and parcel of the Christian tradition, small t, for so many centuries, that somehow sex is not so nice.
The Da Vinci Code has sparked the imagination of many around the world. A novel claiming that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married, had a child, and that a prominent secret society through the ages knew and protected this information. That one of the grand masters was Leonardo da Vinci, and that he hid clues to this theory in his art.
It's become a kind of phenomenon. There are other tours, I think, that go around and show you all of the sites in Paris.
Through the conventions of fiction, the author of the Da Vinci Code reworks historically controversial theological issues.
I think the appeal of the book to a lot of people is, of course, that they see a real gender imbalance, you know, not only in institutional religion, but in every sector of life. And yeah, you know, we get some you know, interesting women who are interested in, you know, learning more about how femininity is represented through the ages.
Portraying Mary Magdalene as the chief apostle, as the wife of Jesus, the book has been both embraced and rejected, but above all, debated.
There is only one force in the world that can challenge faith, and it's not some alternative theory. There have been alternative theories about Jesus Christ forever. The one force that can challenge faith is apathy. People just losing interest. And again, agree or disagree, at least we're talking about it. And that's good for religion.
We started out searching for the truth behind a novel and a centuries-old legend that Jesus may have been married to a woman everybody long considered to be a prostitute. We didn't find any proof that Jesus ever had a wife, or that he left behind a child when he died, nor did we unlock the mysteries behind the Holy Grail. But we did learn a lot more about a man who changed history, and the woman who was very important to him. Whether or not they were husband and wife, this is a love story, because we discovered that Mary Magdalene was closer to Jesus than we ever imagined. Why do you think your book has touched such a nerve?
The mysteries of spirituality, the Holy Grail, the origins of our religions, these are topics that resonate at a deep, deep spiritual level, really at the core of the human psyche. And whether or not, whether you agree or disagree with the topics, they're on the table, and we're talking about them. And these are topics that for centuries have been taboo.
But you get talking only about Mary Magdalene and Jesus and sex, you lose I think, the more important and historically important point that here 20 centuries ago, we had a great religious leader named Jesus of Nazareth who broke through the barriers of cultural bias and had among his disciples and closest friends women who didn't just, go around getting the tea and sweeping up after the boys left. She really was every bit as much an apostle, a companion spokesperson for Jesus and his gospel as any of the men were.
Sometimes religion is presented as something that's fixed and stable, whether you have to accept it or reject it. But the fact is that religious traditions, and certainly Christianity among them, is very diverse, very filled with possibilities. And we need to take responsibility for the kind of religion that we make.
This year, the world is coming to a standstill for football's most prestigious event. We'll bring you deeper and further into the game. Planet Football starts Monday on the National Geographic Channel.